If you ever become aware of how you think or how the society organizes itself, odds are you have come across an ideology. Ideology is all around us, existing in between people, within the society, and among different groups. There's no single definition of ideology or its nature, but its effects can easily be observed as it shapes our thoughts, actions, interactions, and what happens in a society in a bigger scale. The term ideology is used to describe a system of ideas or ideals forming basis for economic or political theory and policy. On a broader scope, it is a system that aspires to both change one's worldview and explain natural occurrences in the world. Practical and prominent elements are often equally present in an ideology. The word ideology emerged during Reign of Terror of the French Revolution. Antoine de Tracy, a French philosopher, coined the French word ideology with an IE instead of a Y from the Greek words idea, meaning form and pattern, and logos, meaning discourse or compilation. De Tracy's term for science of ideas was heavily influenced by ideas from John Locke, Etienne Bonnot de Condillac, and Francis Bacon. Originally, ideology was intended as a foundation for moral and political science. During de Tracy's time, it was meant to be a liberal philosophy that would aid in defending individual liberty, property, free markets, and constitutional limits on state power, which were some of the pressing socio-political problems at the time. Though the concept of an ideology has persisted over the years, the original concept, which was a collection of political proposals, meaning a collection of ideas, has evolved into what is described as integrated assertions, theories, and aims constituting a political-social program, often with an implication of factitious propagandizing by Geertz. Additionally, they stress that ideologies are not merely formed out of disembodied reflection. Rather, ideologies are rooted in the existing life situations or conditions experienced by the thinker. Staying true, however, to the original definition of an ideology, it may be characterized by a few distinct features. The ideology must contain an explanatory theory of human experience and the external world. Based on this understanding of human experience and the external world, a program of social and political organization is created, and it often aims to enact change. Creators of this program are aware that the conception and realization of this program entails struggle. Part of the struggle of realizing such program would be persuading people to become loyal adherents of the ideology and its program. The presence of followers is another defining characteristic of an ideology. Lastly, the ideology must address the wide public. Hence, it is often rooted in the socio-political conditions of the corresponding era. However, despite the diverse audience of an ideology, it often relies on the leadership of an intellectual to effectively realize the program. Ideology is often connected to the concepts of worldview and social paradigm. The concept of worldview refers to the cognitive guide, which is constantly being reinforced by culture of society learned through socialization and social interaction. Worldview influences most of the thinking and actions of an individual, enabling an individual to navigate through his or her social landscape. On the other hand, social paradigm is more restricted than a worldview in two ways. First, social paradigm can be limited to only a set of people and is not necessarily accepted by most members of a society. Second, it pertains only to certain aspects of life rather than the totality of social existence. It is noted that the concept of ideologies is often interchangeable with either worldviews or paradigms in both everyday and social scientific discussions. Ideologies, like worldviews and paradigms, consist of beliefs or belief systems and values. A belief is defined to be a specific idea about aspects of life that its holders are convinced is true regardless of any disconfirming evidence. However, what differentiates ideology from worldviews or social paradigms is the unique characteristics of ideology, which is derived from the worldview and social paradigm. The two characteristics are the following. 1. Intentional formulation of ideology by adherents for a specific purpose. And 2. Potential to be used as a political weapon of those in power as a means of supporting and furthering their power, privileges, actions, and goals, which rarely occurs with worldviews or social paradigms. Now, both religion and ideology consider questions of truth and conduct. Both also demand commitment. However, religion and ideology have differences in their framework. Religion is constructed in terms of a divine order, while an ideology is centered on this world alone. Religion relies on revelation, while ideology always believes that it lives by reason alone. Religion may present a vision of a just society, but does not necessarily have a practical political program. In ideology, social or political philosophy in which practical elements are as prominent as theoretical ones. Religion's focus is on faith and worship, redemption or purification of human spirit, while in ideology, its aim is the constitution of a political social program, often with an implication of factitious propagandizing. In a general sense, both law and ideology are systems of enforceable rules governing social relations and legislated by a political system. It can be said that law is the legal expression of political ideology since its practice is shaped by people's political beliefs. However, connection between the two is complex because of the diversity of definitions of ideology and the various ways in which ideology might be related to law. Law as an ideology can be a source of manipulation by cloaking power and directing subjects in a way that are not transparent to the subjects themselves, which is in contrast with the ideal of law, which is to regulate or restrain power with reference to norms of justice. It is important to note that the view of law as ideology is at odds with central philosophical positions on the nature of law. For example, a positivist conception of law as a set of formal rules, or a natural law conception where law is identified with moral principles. Science and ideology, although both systems of knowledge, follow difference of reasoning and hence of inquiry. This difference reflects the different social conditions behind its respective production. In the production of scientific knowledge, the process is regulated by specific rules, for example, logic of experimental method and empirical references, while propositions of ideology are anti-empirical, confusional, and underpinned by an attitude that is potentially maniacal and omnipotent. However, science can be enlisted to support particular ideologies. Despite science's capacities to render clear and well-verified central cases, its broader applications can become intertwined with separate knowledge claims, values, and ideologies. Alright, now, one popular characterization of ideology is it being a spectrum of particular ideologies with two opposing poles, represented as individualism on one end and collectivism on the other. The political ideologies on the left of the spectrum represent the ones that put more value in fostering collectivist traits and governance, while those more on the right place importance on the freedoms and values of the individual. Interestingly, the ideologies on the left also represent government systems that are totalitarian or authoritarian in nature. On the other hand, ideologies on the right are those more democratic and liberal in nature. This is not to be confused with left-wing or right-wing political spectrum, which primarily concerns itself with the attainment or active abolition of social hierarchies, although they do borrow some elements of individualism and collectivism. In this discussion, we shall define individualism and collectivism as well as compare them to one another, after which we will discuss the ideologies in between, starting with anarchism, moving towards communism. While sociologists have a general sense of what individualism is, there is no full consensus on its official definition. If one had to force a definition, individualism at its most basic level asserts independence in decision making and goal setting without considering the opinions, capabilities, and welfare of others, even those who are part of the same community. In a sense, a person who believes in individualism believes that a person's actions should be motivated and driven by his freedom and his individuality. Individuality in this context is understood to be independent of collective ideas and more inclined towards describing that which is unique to a person. Of course, this assumes that the individual has his own character, personality, desires, and longing for self-determination. Thus, individualism uses a premise the idea that the human individual is the primary instrument for liberation, and that liberation and the ability to self-determine is a greater value than adhering to a collective. Individualism has long existed in humanity's history as conceptions of property rights, human rights, and self-interest. The first recorded policy ever influenced by self-interest had probably been Mesopotamian ruler Urukagina's property laws that date back all the way to the 24th century BCE. Later on, 4th century BCE, Greek philosopher Aristotle in his Politics taught ideas of personal self-fulfillment. He said, "That which is common to the greatest number has the least care bestowed upon it. Everyone thinks chiefly of his own, hardly at all of the common interest, and only when he is himself concerned as an individual," implying that it was innate in human nature to care more about oneself rather than the collective. During the French Revolution, the first usage of the term individualisme was used pejoratively to signify the sources of social dissolution and anarchy. Early on, the term itself included ideas of maximum welfare and freedom for the individual to be provided by the state. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's idea of social contract also lent credibility to the idea of individualism as a strong premise for modern governance. There have been many approaches to understanding individualism. Here are four that have been noted by Waterman. 1. Being true to oneself. 2. Freedom of choice within the constraint of freedom of others. 3. Personal responsibility, which accompanies a sense of being a casually effective agent. 4. Universality, which involves respect of integrity of others. Since there is no agreed upon consensus on the idea of individualism, these four characteristics do not need to be all present for one to consider a behavior or a society to be individualist. The important aspects of an individualistare are as follows. 1. Autonomy. This refers to a person's capacity for independent thinking, judgment, and survival. A person defines him or herself as an autonomous and largely independent agent without references to other people, groups, or institutions. Also, priority is given to one's own aims, decisions, and choices. 2. Mature self-responsibility. A person's self-responsibility serves as a casually effective agent, meaning a person accepts responsibility for the self and for one's actions. Thus, a confidence in one's abilities allows the person to understand that one is the main actor in one's actions. 3. Uniqueness. An individual sees oneself as not being like other people, making one of a kind. Characteristics associated with individualism manifest in many different ways, and thus with the definition, there is no general consensus on its manifestations. Hsu states that individualism manifests itself in societies through the following defining features: self-reliance, competitiveness, aggressive creativity, large military expenditures, insecurity, unrealistic interpersonal and international relations, and prejudice toward different racial and religious groups. Ho and Chu, on the other hand, argued that the important components of individualism were autonomy, individual responsibility, individual achievement, and self-reliance. It is also good to note that there are other concepts of individualism, one being methodological individualism, which is the idea that social phenomena must be explained by showing how they result from individual actions, which in turn must be explained through reference to the intentional states that motivate individual actors. For example, the popular vote in an election is not necessarily performed as a collective, but rather simply as a result of the individual motives of individual actors. Defenders of this concept will argue that it is the most politically neutral view of individualism. However, it should be noted that this concept is very difficult to quantify, and as such, situations should never be reduced to methodological individualism. Another social ontological view of individualism is ontological individualism. The thesis that social or historical groups, processes, and events are nothing more than complexes of individuals and individual actions. In practice, individualism as a foundation for political actions can be seen in the government of people. Individualistic societies tend to advocate individual rights, freedom from the government, and from collective controls and restrictions. These tend to promote Ho and Chu's principles of autonomy, individual responsibility, individual achievement, and self-reliance. Politically and economically, individualism tends to promote anarchism and capitalism because in these scenarios, individual interests rise above the collective interest to develop the entire society. An important question is, does the individual's life belong to him, or does it belong to the group, community, society, or the nation? Collectivism is the idea that the individual's life does not belong to the person himself, but to the group or society which he is a part of. Thus, all his values and belief system must be directed towards what is called the greater good. Some integral concepts of collectivism include: 1. The group has a life of its own outside the lives of the individuals which compose it. For example, the nation. People give a nation its own set of attributes and values which are not necessarily equivalent to the attributes of its citizens. Another example is the state. The welfare of the state does not always pertain to the good of the individuals who live in it, rather the good of them as a collective being. In short, the group is given an intrinsic value resulting to the degradation of one's self-interest. 2. Priority is always given to the group. This is a recurring statement in the different definitions of collectivism. It emphasizes the idea of greater good, where individuals' desires, goals, or needs are often sacrificed to meet those of the group. 3. The construction of identity relies on the relationships among members of the group and the interconnectedness between people as a whole. This implies that building an identity becomes a collective affair. One is identified based on his relationships or his place in the society. The idea of collectivism can be traced back to ancient times. Anthropological studies show that early human societies are collectivist because working and hunting as a group ensured survival. Additionally, early cultural activities are often executed as a group, leading to the emergence of subdivisions we are now familiar of. In order to fully grasp the idea of collectivism, one must have ample understanding of the fundamental concepts that ultimately help build up collectivism as an ideology. The first concept is the communal society and associational community. Ferdinand Tonez clarified the distinction between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, which are two types of social organizations. Gemeinschaft refers to the communal society where personal relationships are defined and regulated on the basis of traditional social rules as observed in small rural communities. Gesellschaft, on the other hand, is also called associational community, characterized by impersonal and indirect human relations, constructed in the interest of efficiency or other economic and political considerations. Another concept which many of us is familiar with is the social contract of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Here, he argues that people should not be guided by self-interest alone. Rather, each individual has a social contract with the rest of the people in society that requires him to consider the collective interest of the group. As a support to the previous concept, Thomas Hobbes, known for his Leviathan, believed that basic human nature is to be evil and greedy, and when left unchecked, those guided by self-interest will end in violence and death. He understood the social contract as a scenario where individuals in society give up some of their freedom to a strong central authority in order to remain safe. For him, the collective security of society is over the individual rights and freedoms of the citizen. Karl Marx had the same belief. In his The Communist Manifesto, he argued that working class people should unite and collectively own and operate the businesses to avoid being exploited by the wealthy owners. Generally, he supports collectivist ideas like collective interest, economic equality, and public ownership. The principles of collectivist societies revolve around economic equality, public ownership, cooperation, collective interest, collective responsibility, adherence to collective norms, and government regulation. Also, intermediate ideologies such as communism, Marxism, and socialism lean towards the value of collectivism. Now, which ideology should remain dominant in a society? Individualism or collectivism? Answering this question would require analyzing these two poles in different levels of philosophic inquiry. Metaphysics is a branch of philosophy concerned with the fundamental nature of reality. For the metaphysical individualism, the philosophic inquiry comes from Frederick Douglass. I am myself, you are yourself. We are two distinct persons, equal persons. What you are, I am. You are man, and so am I. God created both and made us separate beings. I am not by nature bound to you, or you to me. Nature does not make your existence depend upon me, or mine to depend upon yours. I cannot walk upon your legs, or you upon mine. I cannot breathe for you, or you for me. I must breathe for myself, and you for yourself. We are distinct persons, and are each equally provided with faculties necessary to our individual existence. In leaving you, I took nothing but what belonged to me, and in no way lessened your means for obtaining an honest living. Your faculties remained yours, and mine became useful to their rightful owner. For metaphysical collectivism, the philosophical inquiry comes from John Dewey. Society, in its unified and structural character, is the fact of the case. The non-social individual is an abstraction arrived at by imagining what man would be if all his human qualities were taken away. Society, as a real whole, is the normal order, and the mass as an aggregate of isolated units is the fiction. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy concerned with the means and nature of knowledge. For epistemological individualism, the philosophical inquiry comes from Ayn Rand. Knowledge is a product of the perceptual observations and mental integrations of individuals. Who looks at reality, hears reality, touches reality, reasons about reality, and thereby gains knowledge of reality? The individual does. The individual possesses eyes, ears, hands, and the like. The individual possesses a mind and the capacity to use it. For epistemological collectivism, the philosophic inquiry comes from Helen Longino. Knowledge is produced by cognitive processes that are fundamentally social. Without individuals, there would be no knowledge because it is through their sensory system that the natural world enters cognition. The activities of knowledge construction, however, are the activities of individuals in interaction. Thus, knowledge is constructed not by individuals, but by an interactive dialogic community. Ethics is concerned with the nature and value of proper human interaction. For ethical individualism, the philosophic inquiry comes from Ayn Rand. Just as the individual, not the group, is metaphysically real, and just as the individual, not the collective, has a mind and thinks, so too, the individual, not the community or society, is the fundamental unit of moral concern. The individual is morally an end in himself, not a means to the end of others. Each individual should pursue his life-serving values and respect the rights of others to do the same. This is the morality that follows from the metaphysics and epistemology of individualism. For ethical collectivism, the philosophic inquiry comes from Marie's law. That which, more than anything, marks the distinction between civilized and uncivilized society is that in the former, the individual is nothing and society is everything. In the latter, society is nothing and the individual is everything. In a civilized society, man has no rights except those which society permits him to enjoy. From the day of his birth until the day of his death, society allows him to enjoy certain so-called rights and deprives him of others, not because society desires especially to favor or oppress the individual, but because its own preservation, welfare, and happiness are the prime considerations. And so that society may not perish, so that it may reach a still higher plane, so that men and women may become better citizens, society permits them certain privileges and restricts them in the use of others. Sometimes, in the exercise of this power, the individual is put to a great deal of inconvenience. Even at times, he suffers what appears to be injustice. This is to be regretted, but it is inevitable. The aim of civilized society is to do the greatest good to the greatest number, and because the largest number may derive benefit from the largest good, the individual must subordinate his own desires or inclinations for the benefit of all. Politics are ideas related to political systems, policies, or governance. For political individualism, the philosophic inquiry comes from Craig Biddle. The politics of individualism envisions a society in which the government does only one thing and does it well. protects the rights of all individuals equally by banning the use of physical force from social relationships and by using force only in retaliation and only against those who initiate its use. In such a society, government uses force as necessary against thieves, extortionists, murderers, rapists, terrorists, and the like, but it leaves peaceful, rights-respecting citizens completely free to live their lives and pursue their happiness in accordance with their own judgment. Toward that end, a proper rights-respecting government consists of legislature, courts, police, a military, and any other branches and departments necessary to the protection of individual rights. This is the essence of the politics of individualism, which follows logically from the metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics of individualism. For political collectivism, the philosophic inquiry comes from Michael Tomasky. This, historically, is the moral basis of liberal governance. Not justice, not equality, not rights, not diversity, not government, and not even prosperity or opportunity. Liberal governance is about demanding of citizens that they balance self-interest with common interest. This is the only justification leaders can make to citizens for liberal governments, really. That all are being asked to contribute to a project larger than themselves. Citizens sacrificing for and participating in the creation of a common good. Liberalism was built around the idea, the philosophical principle, that citizens should be called upon to look beyond their own self-interest and work for a greater common interest. Going now to the ideologies located between the two poles, we start with anarchism. On the rightmost, most individualistic side of our spectrum lies anarchism, which espouses and promotes the abolition of government authority through violent means if necessary, and the adoption of a society that is based on voluntary cooperation. The working idea behind anarchism is that the privileged man is a man depraved in intellect and heart, abandoning the pursuit of truth and instead seeking the protection of their own power. As these people tend to run state institutions, they corrupt these systems for their benefit. By keeping the masses ignorant, these privileged people maintain the enslavement of the masses. Anarchists believe that to rectify this error, for an individual's life to be free and fulfilled, all forms of authority must be rejected. This leads to the formation of highly atomized individuals, or small communities that band together out of small voluntary cooperation. There are various forms of anarchism, for example, religious anarchism, political anarchism, etc. And one of the major proponents of political anarchism is the Russian revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin. Next we go to libertarianism. Libertarianism is the advocacy of liberty and free will, wherein the government is only expected to provide the basic needs for the people and to not interfere further with their individual rights. Collectivist values in the libertarian environment is seen as an infringement on people's rights, coercive and oppressive. Personal, religious, cultural, and other rights of the individual is respected by the government, and laws and policies are created by the state to recognize and protect these liberties. Moreover, most democracies worldwide employ concepts of libertarianism, especially in the realm of economic policy. A libertarian economy, usually in the form of a laissez-faire capitalism or free market economy system, is typified as an economic order based on private property and voluntary market relationships among agents. Through the regulation, competition, and other policies benefiting the operations of these private entities, the libertarian government banks hope that this better working environment would spur economic growth that could fuel and provide for the needs of the society. There are many proponents and shapers of libertarianism, from the historical thinkers of classical liberal tradition, John Locke, David Hume, Adam Smith, Immanuel Kant, John Rawls, to free market thinkers like Friedrich Hayek, Ayn Rand, and Robert Nozick. Next down the line is socialism. Commonly known as the transition state between communism and libertarianism, socialism is an ideology and method of government that promotes state ownership and regulation of industries, and central control over the allocation of resources rather than allowing these to be determined by market forces. These are very similar traits as communism's. However, what separates socialism from communism is that socialists believe that this change does not require a violent revolution, that this change can be achieved through peaceful means. Socialism is a more moderate version of communism. wherein the total elimination of all private property is not sought after. Instead, the main goal is to simply narrow the gap between the rich and the poor through principles of planned economy and income redistribution. A welfare state is the ultimate goal of socialism. Proponents of this ideology include Robert Owens, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Engels, among others. Next is fascism. The fascist ideology centers on the idea that individuals and generations are bound together by the law and political will of the nation. Just like communism, fascism is characterized as a highly collectivist ideology. As the law and the will of the nation takes precedence over the individual wills of its citizens. All human and spiritual values are forced to lie within the state. All individual action are directed to preserve and expand it. Power is the central focus of fascism, being highlighted with a strong sense of nationalism, expansionism and militarization, the suppression of personal and cultural liberties, and typically, a strong leadership at the helm of the fascist state. Giovanni Gentile is usually credited as the main philosopher behind the fascist ideology, as he was one of the prime shapers of the rise of the Italian fascist state under Benito Mussolini during World War II. During the same period, fascism also spread to Spain, under Francisco Franco, and Germany, the latter manifesting in a modified form of fascism, Nazism. Finally, we go to communism. Typified as the antithesis to capitalism, communism is a core collectivist ideology that centers on the idea of class struggle between the proletariat, meaning the working class, and the bourgeois, meaning the wealthy elites. Communism seeks to abolish this class divide by eliminating private property in favor of communal ownership, usually through the means of an armed revolution of the working class. The state becomes the primary owner of the major societal resources such as property, means of production, education, agriculture, and transportation. It also employs income redistribution to further weaken class systems. Communism stresses the equality of outcome, wherein everyone shares the benefits of labor equally. Moreover, the revitalization of work is another concept of communism, wherein the ideology attempts to reverse the capitalist trend of worker alienation and the lack of fulfillment of work. Communism is a product of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and has been greatly influential in shaping numerous government systems worldwide, such as in Cuba, Vietnam, and China. Since ideology encompasses our worldview and our corresponding actions, our perception of it is crucial. This cognizance of ideology serves as a foundation for our understanding of governance, power, class dynamics, and modern society as we know it. What ideas influence how wealth is distributed? What concepts preclude discrimination, oppression, and revolution? How should we move forward? In a world where the media discourse is saturated with false information and fear mongering from both sides of the spectrum, the search for answers is difficult. Yet the search is necessary. Whatever ideology one decides to ascribe to, whether it be collectivism, individualism, or all the ideologies in between, let that choice be one built on understanding. After all, nothing is more dangerous to the collective or individual than ignorance.